Well, ladies and gentlemen, since the expectant hush has fallen, I shall begin. Good evening.
Good evening.
How good to see you. Thank you very much for coming out on this, not that it's particularly cold, winter night to listen to me. I always enjoy sharing my opinions with other people and telling them what I think, and if you're polite enough to give me an audience, well, I'm deeply grateful, because some people just run a mile. So thank you very much. I'm afraid that I have spoiled the suspense of what I'm going to say somewhat by giving you all an outline which you can take home, but well, anyway, there we are. I'll expand on that. I have to give you some housekeeping matters to begin with. The lavatories, if you want to go to the lavatories are through those doors there, and then through those doors there, and then to left and right. And the event of a fire alarm, remain as a group and move to our evacuation point, which is just the quad out there. In the event of an earthquake, drop, cover, and hold. When the shaking stops, please evacuate. I assume that means the building rather than your bowels. Fire, yes, activate the nearest alarm, dial 6111, medical emergency 6111. Righto, we'll deal with that. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Who speaks for the trees, the possible futures of conservation? I've got one or two interesting things to say to you tonight, and I'm going to end with just a little bit of speculation, which I'm not going to say is going to happen at all, but I'm just interested in, well, as you will see, in the situation. The possible futures of conservation is perhaps a slightly unsettling phrase, because it suggests, obviously, that there can be more than one possible future. Yet, how can that be, we might think to ourselves, because conservation is, we might say, is a self-evident good. The only possible acceptable future is to have more of it, and anything else, surely, is to be feared. Well, there are some future possibilities which are frightening, but we should think about that. They might happen. There's no rule that only good things happen. Bad things do happen. And after all, forewarned is forearmed. And if we know what the situation is, then we might head off these bad possibilities at the pass. Or better still, we might do what we can to align these forces acting in the world so that, if possible, they do work for good. But in any case, nothing is more certain than that there is going to be change, and there always is in everything. And conservationists among others always say this all the time: there's going to be change. Nothing is more certain. Well, it's happening here too, and I do notice in some of my conservationist friends a complete blindness to the possibility that our conservation laws could ever change in a bad way. The Conservation Act, the Wildlife Act, the National Parks Act, you get the impression from the way some of my friends talk, some of your friends talk, some of you talk perhaps, you'd get the impression that they were carved in stone, that they were entrenched, that the thought of any amendment to these acts is completely impossible. But that, of course, is not the case. They can be changed just like any other act of Parliament. We say that our conservation lands are ours, but that doesn't mean just that they belong to the enthusiasts, the people like us in this room who actually love them and know them and go out there. It means that they belong to every last person who lives in Auckland, and Wellington and Hamilton and everywhere else, every last person in New Zealand, an increasing number of city dwellers, all of whom have votes. They also all own our conservation lands, and they're going to vote for people who are going to serve their interests. And if their interests require more money to go to them and less money to go to conservation, and so there can be environmental damage in the wilds, well, sooner or later, that is what is going to happen. And I was alarmed, well, I was a bit surprised recently to read Lou Sanson, Director General of Conservation himself, that he was quoted in the Listener, and he said, what did he say? His exact words were, "A lot of our legislation was devised in the 1960s, and we do have to look at a refresh of the National Parks Act, the Wildlife Act. The Conservation Act is 30 years old. We are talking to the Minister about that." Well, he hasn't talked to the public about that. I don't know what his ideas are, but anyway, that's what Lou is thinking of. What is he thinking of, I wonder? This is pure speculation, but the Wildlife Act, What's wrong with that? Is there more scope he's thinking of for Maori taking of protected species? The Conservation Act, is there more scope for exchanges of land? The elimination of the preference in the Act for recreation, or possibly different rules about hut fees? The National Parks Act. I can't think of any changes necessary to the National Parks Act, but Lou does. What might they be? But anyway, I'm wondering about change myself, and it occurs to me, and this is, I think, going to be my theme, if anything is tonight, that certain changes which have occurred or are occurring right now already, they make further big changes at least possible. I'm not saying that amazing big changes are going to happen, but our world is not the certain place it was, and certain things that have happened already may mean that some other big changes are in the wind. That's a possibility. Well, conservation in New Zealand is an almost sacred name. There's still, I think, almost a superstitious horror attached to attacking or questioning conservation. But how long that will last, I can't say. But I do think that conservation as a cause is in danger in a way in which it wasn't about 20 years ago, 20 or more. And the threats to conservation are, in a sense, a new problem because we live now in a new New Zealand. New Zealand is not what it was. In the past, we were not the urban people we are now. We had a smaller population. We were all closer to the land, even if we lived in cities. Our parents, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles, we all had country connections. And in the past also, there was an abundance of resources. There were rivers for everyone. There were rivers for everything. There was never any thought of competition for rivers between recreationists and naturalists and electricity and dairy farming and so on. When the Water and Soil Conservation Act was made in 1967, it didn't actually give any criteria for deciding about water rights, as they were called, because no one thought that there might actually be competition. But now we have to make a choice. And I think more and more, if you were to say to many people in Auckland or Hamilton or Wainuiomata or even Christchurch, if you were to say to them, which would you rather have? Would you accept significant resources of one sort or another for your lifestyle for the sake of a river with a strange name in the South Island which you've never heard of and are never going to visit? I think more and more there are people who are going to say, look, I'll vote for my lifestyle, thanks very much, and to hell with the river. Anyway, that's the strength of the conservation movement and our conservation attitudes depend on the sort of people we are. And without a strong conservation ethos in New Zealand, the Department of Conservation and the cause of conservation simply is not going to be as strong now as it was in the gallant days in the past. Now, I don't believe all the rhetoric which we constantly pat ourselves on the back with about how we're a deeply environmentally conservation-minded nation. I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that's the case. There is a strong element of that, of course, and we are testimony to it. But nevertheless, I don't believe it all, and I don't think fooling yourself generally is a good thing to do. I must say that my general views about the future of environmental law are a bit on the gloomy side. Mostly environmental laws exist to stop people from doing things they want to. That's the way our environmental laws are phrased. You want to do something, but the Resource Management Act or some other piece of legislation stands in your way, and you've got to leap through so many hoops before you can actually achieve your end. And as the world becomes a more crowded and desperate place, we begin to think what was previously unthinkable. And we want to exploit resources we've never looked at before, and I'm going to mention some examples of that, because that's the only way to postpone the evil day just a little bit longer and to maintain our unsustainable lifestyles. And the more crowded, especially New Zealand becomes, the more addicted we get to comfort, the more we in New Zealand have to do that. And I have to confess that I often suspect that all our conservation efforts, admirable as they are really just shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic. But anyway, a few points. First, there are still covetous eyes cast on the public conservation estate. The fact that land is in the public conservation estate doesn't mean that it's going to be sacred forever. And so, for example, irrigation interests still have hopes or until recently, until a recent decision of the Supreme Court, they had hopes of flooding portions of the Lake Sumner Forest Park and the Aoraki Forest Park for irrigation schemes downstream. There's a hydro scheme proposed for the Morgan Gorge on the Waitaha River, which is a wonderful, wild, major West Coast river, stewardship land on the coast. There are controversial coal mines, in particular around the Denniston Plateau, and there's talk of more coal mines there, and indeed Forest and Bird alleges that a secret cross-department plan exists. This is Forest and Bird's allegation, developed for the Ministers of Conservation, Energy and Resources and Economic Development, which would make public conservation land available to privately owned coal mining companies. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what Forest and Bird thinks. You may recall that in 2014 there was made the West Coast Windblown Timber Conservation Lands Act to enable trees which were blown over or damaged by Cyclone Eta on the West Coast to be salvaged. The West Coast interests now are talking very seriously about having a similar statute, another statute made, which would actually enable sustainable logging of one sort or another on conservation lands on the coast to continue. So we might, before very long, if that happens, we might be back to where we were before the conservation movement got going and protected many of those lands. And then there's tourism, of which more anon. So we're not out of the woods yet, even as far as basic exploitation of the conservation estate goes. Now, I think it would be tragic for some of these things to happen, but I must explain that my reason is not just that these places are sacred and should never be touched, because there are good arguments that we should be able to use the natural world with respect and love. The argument that things should be sacred and never ever touched, that's one attitude to the natural world. Genuine, wise, loving use in a respectful, gentle spirit, there are arguments for that too. There are arguments for and against sacredness and putting things apart. But what we're talking about with this exploitation isn't wise, loving use. We're talking about coal mining and logging. We're talking about the ransacking of the natural world, industrial exploitation. Well, I'm speaking tonight wearing my law lecturer hat, which we might think is an unusual perspective for approaching conservation, but it's not just law I'm looking at. It will be general social events and current events and social development as well. But there's always law as the background to everything. Everything that's done has to have a legal basis. Well, actually, as I shall observe, this is not always true of the Department of Conservation, whose respect for its own laws do leave a considerable amount to be desired. But there should, anyway, be a legal background to everything. The law is seldom in the limelight. It is occasionally, as in the Ruataniwha case, of which more anon. But whether the law is in the limelight or not, the law does tell us something about what's actually going on. Now, to clear things up at the beginning, I am not going to spend any time tonight talking about the exciting new fashionable idea of giving legal personality and legal rights to natural objects, such as the former Urewera National Park, it's not the Urewera National Park anymore, or the Wanganui River, the idea of giving them legal personality. That's not a new idea. It's struck the public of this country as a new idea, but it's been floated most notably since the early 1970s by an American professor, Christopher Stone, who suggested that giving legal personality to natural objects would solve several procedural legal issues which were important at the time, questions of locus standi and onus of proof, as we lawyers say. Professor Stone never suggested that giving legal personality to natural objects would enable them to be protected forever. His argument was simply that if you gave these legal rights, legal personality to natural objects, that would just guarantee that they would have a say in decisions about them. Their interests would be considered, although their interests wouldn't necessarily be conclusive. Now, in the long run, of course, the grant of legal personality to these objects might also, in the long run, enable us to think of them in a different way, but that was very long term. But I don't think that's actually going to solve any problems, giving legal personality to natural objects, because even if they do have legal personality, even if the river or the mountain or the forest has legal personality, it still has human beings speaking for it and making decisions on its behalf. Human beings are still in charge, and they might make all sorts of decisions which they calculate may be for the greater good in the long run. It's a cute idea. It's a nice idea. I mustn't demean it by calling it cute, but I really think it is a bit of a dead end. And if it's of any use, it's going to be because of the long-term attitude change which it might engender. Well, the prospects for conservation in New Zealand. The biggest issue facing us is, of course, the prevention of further extinctions and the recovery of threatened populations of native species. And this is expensive. There was some research done in 2010 which concluded that DOC's current budget for species management and recovery was 1/10 of what was needed. And I cannot see any government of any political hue increasing the department's budget by the required amount. If the department spent less of its budget actually subsidising the tourism industry, yes, subsidising, then things might be a bit different, but even then there still wouldn't be enough. There's never going to be enough money for the predator control operations, the species recovery operations which are needed. And that's why we have so many mainland sanctuaries, little sanctuaries, fenced areas here and there, which are extremely expensive and often unprofitable to build and maintain. And of course they require constant vigilance. The moment the fence goes down and the predators get through, everything's gone and you're back to square one. And that is why, hitherto, there have been good arguments also for a certain degree of private involvement in conservation. Here is a patch of bush on Banks Peninsula, a patch of bush privately owned, which is, let us say, a prime habitat for jewelled geckos, but they're being preyed upon by cats and possums and what have you. Well, what do we do in that situation? We want to save the geckos. It's private land. The department doesn't own it. Even if it did own it, it couldn't afford to protect the lizard population. So what does one do in that situation? If you just slap some sort of protection zoning or order over it, that's simply going to irritate the local farmer who owns it, and it's not going to help the lizards one little bit, because it's impossible to order the landowner to care for the lizards. You might be able to say to the farmer, don't cut those trees down, but you can't say to him, care for the lizards, trap around the lizards, put a predator-proof fence around the lizards. So wouldn't it make sense in that situation to offer some incentive to the landowner to look after his lizards? Some landowners will do it anyway, out of love, but even then they could do with some financial assistance. If someone wanted to breed jewelled geckos, what would be the objection? Poaching would be an obvious one, but microchipping and modern computer ID could surely solve that problem, and the existence of a legitimate gecko trade would quite possibly destroy the market for smuggled hot geckos. If Mr. Roger Beattie on Banks Peninsula at his own expense wants to breed the eastern buff weka, once common on the east coast of the South Island, now only found on the Chathams, if he wants to breed it back here in its original home, how can we object? Now, poaching certainly is one issue to think of, wild wekas being passed off as farmed ones, but apart from that, is there any other objection? Yet the department seems to set its face very firmly against any sort of private breeding programs. It's even keen, I believe, to shut down red-fronted, red-crowned parakeet breeding programs. And generally there seems to be an inclination, a hesitation on the part of conservationists to shrink back from what seems to be a step towards the privatisation of creation. And we might think also that it is one of the natural and proper functions of the entire community and of the state to look after its own environment and native species. It shouldn't have to be left to private individuals. But if the community isn't prepared to front up with the sums of money involved, what else can be done? And that is why the Predator-Free New Zealand project is such an exciting idea, because it would do away with the need for all of these mainland sanctuaries and islands and native species under guard, do the job once, remove particular predators, mustelids, rats, possums and feral cats, not the lovely little domestic ones, from all of the, I'm a dog man myself, from all of the South Island, Stewart Island, and once they are gone, then an immense number of problems are solved. And it now does seem possible, and actually with little change in the law. There would need to be some fiddling around with the Biosecurity Act, but the Biosecurity Act almost covers the situation now. That is an exciting possibility. I'm not worried, I must say, about the crazies in the anti-1080 brigade, although you'll have heard this morning of damage done somewhere around Nelson, vandalism there in a sanctuary just before a drop. If there were ever any doubts about the wisdom of 1080 as the best weapon which we have at present, then they were surely laid to rest by the publication recently of Dave Hansford's book, Protecting Paradise. But I am actually just a little more worried about what seems to me to be a surprising level of doubt among some scientists. Far more sensible people, and all sorts of people are actually wondering whether predator-free New Zealand is actually a good thing or not. And here we have Joe Bennett expressing doubts in the press about it, and several other scientists whom I have communicated with privately, who I'm not going to name, but I must say I was surprised at a number of people who actually thought that we shouldn't, this is a philosophical, a moral proposition, not a scientific proposition, and so it's one where they have no special expertise. It's not a scientific question, but I have been surprised at a number of people who have simply said that this is not something that we should actually be doing. And you may have heard an interview last year, I've got some notes on it of my own here, when Kim Hill interviewed a Dr. Jamie Steer, who wrote an allegedly scientific dissertation on the reconciliation of introduced species in New Zealand, which appears to be simply a philosophical defence of the idea that species that have been introduced here should be left here. And he actually says that we should be prepared to accept some level of extinctions, and that we owe introduced species more than a humane death. So we're not going to kill the introduced species. No, they can't become extinct. But we are allowed to contemplate, we should be contemplating the extinction of native species. I don't see why introduced species existing in other parts of the world actually have to take priority over native species existing here. But this is what the scientist is arguing. I would like to talk about that at greater length, but I'd simply refer you to an article of mine published in the New Zealand Journal of Environmental Law last year, which dwells on the subject and tears Dr. Steer to shreds. Anyway, I suggest a certain alignment between his philosophical views and actually political views, generally political views also, but I'll talk about that later, perhaps in question time. No, predator-free New Zealand is the best thing that's happened in a long time. But it seems to me there's one remarkable thing about predator-free New Zealand that not many people seem to have noticed, which is that the job of running predator-free New Zealand has not been given, as you might expect it would be, to the Department of Conservation. There's a brand new entity, Predator-Free New Zealand, it's called Predator-Free 2050 Limited, and it's a Crown entity, but it is different from the Department of Conservation, and the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment herself cannot, she says, it is not evident how this organisation will interact with the department. And I can't help but think to myself, and this is, I think, a significant point, why was the department not given the job? The department has immense expertise in this area already, not just with 1080. I would have thought it was the obvious home for a predator-free initiative. Now, certainly Predator-Free New Zealand, the plan is that eventually it will cover the entire country, not just the conservation estate, but nevertheless its focus is going to be on the conservation estate for a good few years. The department's got the expertise, so why wasn't the department given the job? Now, I don't know, but it must mean something, and it might have implications in any case for the future. And I can't help but wonder if it is actually a little ominous for the department, or even if it's not ominous now, it could be turned against the department in the future. And when one thinks of certain other aspects of the department, I do wonder a little more. Just harking back to privatisation for a second, I was talking about the privatisation of species. There have also been concerns expressed in the past about possible privatisation of the entire public conservation estate. Professor Peter Hartley and the Business Roundtable suggested that in the 1980s. There was a Treasury paper just floating the idea in 2006. And when we think of the privatisation of the estate, we may think of big business taking over national parks and running them commercially. But I can almost imagine privatisation of the estate coming from other directions because, as I'm going to say in a second, the department has also abandoned the maintenance of huts and tracks in large areas of the less well-known parts of the public conservation estate, and these huts and tracks are being maintained now by volunteers who get some funding from the department, certainly, which is administered by a consortium of deerstalkers, FMC, and the Trail Fund of mountain bikers. But it's all volunteer labour, and the money is just used for materials and helicopters bringing the materials in and so on. And so the department has abandoned, essentially, these areas of the estate as far as recreation goes. And I can't help but think to myself that at some time in the future, some of these tramping clubs and others doing this work might get a bit weary about being treated just as unpaid labour, and they might be saying to themselves, look, we've been working on this valley for all these years. It's about time that you actually gave us some recognition as having a certain sort of interest in it, which would be privatisation from completely the opposite direction. Right, well, I'm starting to wonder to myself, actually, how much longer can the department survive in its present form? I have no special inside information about what is going on. This is pure speculation, and it may be just craziness on my part, but just let me mention several straws in the wind. I've mentioned one already, that Predator-Free New Zealand isn't actually a departmental initiative. I do hesitate a little in saying this. I have several conservationist friends who, if I ever utter a word of criticism of the department, they at once accuse me, to use an unlovely phrase, of dumping on the department and attacking it and regarding it as an enemy. And I say, no, that's not true at all. I'm simply just giving some reasonable criticism. And this does seem to be a widespread attitude, and although I can see good reason for it, I think it's also unfortunate. The department has its enemies. It's had them from its origins. The Business Roundtable and the Treasury didn't want it to be created, and there are other enemies too to this day. But conservationists naturally are reluctant to give ammunition to the department's enemies, and in one sense, obviously, that's very sensible, but it's also very unfortunate because it does inhibit conservationists from speaking freely. They always have to pull their punches, and the department is aware of this and is always able to take advantage of it. There's always the unspoken threat: criticise us and you'll get something worse. And so we should just put up with what the department does. And I think it might perhaps be better if some of the department's deficiencies were spoken about in a loving way, just a little more. So let me just mention several other things that the department's been involved in which might give cause for disquiet and make us think about possible futures. One is the Ruataniwha case, which I shouldn't spend too long on. I have several pages on it, I notice. But it was this is a case which went to the, you will have heard about it just early this year. It was a decision, eventually went to the Supreme Court. It was brought by the Royal Forest and Bird Protection Society against the department. Think of that, Forest and Bird actually bringing a case against the Department of Conservation all the way to the Supreme Court. Isn't that pretty amazing? How many hundreds of thousands of dollars of its members' funds did Forest and Bird spend doing the department's job for it? Briefly, I'm sorry. I heard the Director General of Conservation speaking at the FMC AGM in Christchurch a couple of years ago, and he delicately, this was before the litigation actually started, was on its way, and he delicately hinted that he was not necessarily entirely displeased that the department, that Forest and Bird was challenging the department's decision. It was actually his decision. His signature was on it. I think it's actually disgraceful. Forgive me, Mr. Sanson. I think it's disgraceful that you should take that attitude. But more on that later. The general arrangement of the case was this. As you know, there are various categories, you probably know this, there are various categories of conservation land, and the bottom category is stewardship land, which is simply land which does not have any higher designation, and then there can be all sorts of higher designations. If land is stewardship land, it can be exchanged for other land, as well as there is a net conservation benefit. Although even that's dubious. You may recall the Crystal Basin exchange here in Canterbury several years ago. The conservation benefit of that was arguable, but let's leave that there. And it was following that Crystal Basin exchange, which did go ahead, that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment recommended that the department actually get a move on and reclassify land which had been sitting in its to-do file for the last 30 years. Well, the Rua Taniwha case concerned an exchange of land, but the problem was that the land to be exchanged wasn't stewardship land. It was actually Forest Park, which was a higher area, a protected category. So what the department had to do, it had to downgrade the status of this land from Forest Park, Conservation Park, down to stewardship land, and then exchange it. There were two decisions to be made, and there were no criteria really given in the Act as to the decision on as to what criteria should be used in deciding to downgrade. And there was much learned discussion about this. The exchange was being effected in order to enable an enormous dam to be erected on the Makarora River to enable the intensification of agriculture on the rich plains of Hawke's Bay below. And the department argued that the exchange would mean that the public conservation estate would be enlarged, that human prosperity would be enhanced, there'd be water available for reliable irrigation, the department would show it was a reasonable landowner willing to recognise and provide for the public good. But nevertheless, this was going to drown an area of the conservation estate which had been protected, which did have conservation value. It would block the flow of a river, it block the movement of fishes forever. It would promote an intensive agricultural system, which arguably is not very good for the earth. And it would also be the most dreadful precedent, because there are plenty of hungry eyes on the conservation estate, and if it's possible to, and there's also about 1/3 of the conservation estate which is actually stewardship land, much wonderful land which should have a higher level of protection, is stewardship land, and that could simply be exchanged. That is, and if land could be downgraded to stewardship land, that would be the most dreadful precedent. Well, in the end, the Supreme Court found for Forest and Bird, and held that once land in the conservation estate did have a higher level of protection, then it had that forever, unless there was some particular good reason about that land itself, a fire, a volcanic eruption, something which destroyed the natural values of that land itself. So the public conservation estate was not a fungible fund which could be exchanged in order to build up its qualities. We might breathe a sigh of relief that the Supreme Court held that there could be no downgrading of this already protected land. We might think to ourselves, well, everything's fine then. But several points. First, regardless of what the outcome of that case was, this is what the department wanted. This is Lou Sanson's signature is saying, I approve of this exchange. What does that say about the department? If right, we'll get onto the motivation for that in a second. But surely, there's no doubt about it, that has sapped the confidence of many people in the department, many people and many members of the public, if they see the department countenancing such exchanges as this, and for the purpose of promoting intensive agriculture. Another consequence of the judgment of the Supreme Court, you may recall a couple of years ago, after the Crystal Basin controversy here at Porter Heights, the Parliamentary Commissioner recommended that DOC should hurry up and move land out of its stewardship category to give it a higher status. Well, the department will probably be more reluctant to do that now if it thinks that, well, once it's got a higher status, it's going to be stuck forever. And also, after this decision, the Minister raised the possibility of amending the Conservation Act to allow exchanges such as this to take place. Now, there was some outrage at that. Geoffrey Palmer thought it was a constitutional outrage, but I don't actually think that was all that unreasonable, because all the time Parliament changes statutes which run contrary to desired policy. 4 out of 9 judges, there were majority decisions in the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, 4 out of 9 judges thought that this downgrading should be possible. And you may be surprised to learn this, the Conservation Authority had previously recommended exactly the same thing, that the Conservation Act should be amended to allow the exchange of other categories of land above stewardship land. Well, the Ruataniwha case, why did the department fight it? Why did it take this case to the Supreme Court? Was it under instruction from the government to do so? Well, there is a temptation in some conservationists to blame everything on the wicked government. This is the argument. The department is trying to do its best, but the government keeps starving it of money and giving it unlawful instructions. Well, there might be a grain of truth in that. It's certainly true that with the tourism boom being so important, the management of the conservation estate is a matter of high public policy, and it would certainly be interesting to be a fly on the wall when the Director General and the Minister meet. But there is supposed to be a distinction between governance and operational management, and the Minister shouldn't step over that line. And as well as that, you can't explain everything that way. There is abundant anecdotal evidence of unfortunate attitudes within the department, which I'm not going to mention, but that is my view. And the outdoor recreation community in particular has run up against those attitudes for years. And indeed, if everything were the fault of the wicked government ordering the wonderful people at DOC HQ at gunpoint, then I think the only honourable attitude in senior officials in the department is actually resignation, or the threat of resignation, the threat at least. And then you might see what happens, but no one seems inclined to resign. So why did DOC do it? Is it instructions from the government? Is it a genuine belief that this is a good thing? Is it fear? Is it a belief that if the department didn't do it, the department would somehow be made to, or at the very least it would be held against the department in future? Well, I suppose that's possible too, that Lou Sanson may have done this out of fear of what would happen if he didn't do it. There would be such unpopularity. But if that is so, what does that say about the status of the department in New Zealand and the strength of the conservation movement in New Zealand? Interestingly, oh dear, I may have just skipped what I was going to say about the fettering of the minister's discretion. The department argued in the Ruataniwha case that planning instruments, those CMSs which we spend so long making public submissions on, the department argued point blank that these do not bind the minister and do not constrain her decision-making powers. That the department, so it argued, had the arbitrary power, which we thought had disappeared in the 17th century, to ignore planning instruments which it didn't like. The Supreme Court had no time for that attitude and dismissed it. But the department has often shown a certain high-handed attitude to its own planning documents, and FMC, you may recall cases where the Ombudsman found that the department had behaved in a very high-handed way concerning guided walkers on the Rootburn track, and thought that the department's attitude was disgraceful. There. Look, what did the Ombudsman say? Yes, the increase in guided walker numbers flew in the face of the limits in the management plan and made a mockery of the process of public consultation and undermined public participation. And there's been another case since involving helicopter landings on the flanks of Mount Tutiko in Fiordland, where the management plan says 8 landings a day and the 10 landings a day, and the department, just like that, has said, no, we're going to allow 80 helicopter landings a day. The management plan may say that, but we're going to ignore that completely. I could give you other examples too, but time doesn't allow. But that is not a very satisfactory arrangement at all. An immense amount of public participation goes into these plans. The department has umpteen means at its disposal. We've all seen Yes Minister, which you remember Mrs. Thatcher described not as not being a comedy, but rather as being a documentary, and it's appalling that the department should be entitled, if it doesn't get its way there, simply to trample these documents down. Many people are quietly unhappy about the department's seemingly high-handed ways from time to time, and its readiness to ignore its legal obligations. And just on this point, tourism. Jolly important, of course, economically, and you might argue that it has to be accommodated on the public conservation estate, and yes, indeed, it does have to be allowed. But what the law actually says, interestingly, Section 6, paragraph E of the Conservation Act, says that subject to the overriding duty to conservation, the department shall foster recreation, but only allow tourism. And yet, the department speaks openly about spending 1/3 of its budget on tourism. It admits this openly. Senior officials have said in public that they have left this notion of preferring recreation well behind, and we are clearly into encouraging and enabling tourism. And that was what Lou Sanson also said a couple of years ago at the FMC AGM, and you hear this all the time from departmental officers. And for all that it spends about 1/3 of its budget on tourism, recent research by Dr. Valentina Dinicha of Victoria University of Wellington concludes that the department gets only 9% of its income from the tourism industry through concessions, user fees, donations and sponsorships. So we end up in the situation that more money goes into tourism than the department gets out of tourism, and the Department of Conservation is actually subsidising the tourism industry in clear breach of a statutory instruction that all it is allowed to do is allow tourism. That's a blatant contradiction of the law, and yet no one outside traditional users appears to have noticed. The traditional users, hunters, trampers, mountaineers, they have, but no one else. The department years ago abandoned its legal duty to foster recreation. It's made some very serious attempts to get rid of most of the huts on the public conservation estate, especially in the VAMP proposal of the late 1990s. And now, as I say, it's mostly volunteers who are administering much of the estate. And as for hut fees, the department oscillates between relentlessly pursuing a bottom line of maximising revenue and just leaving the current completely unsatisfactory system running. Let me ask you a question. If, when it comes to parking on the streets of Christchurch, putting money in parking meters, if a substantial proportion of the population, 1/3 or half the population, the figure is unclear, did not put money in the meters, just parked their cars there, didn't put money in the meters, walked away, nothing happened, wouldn't we think that was outrageous? We would, wouldn't we? Yes, and why would anyone put money in the meters at all? And such a system would be universally execrated, and we'd think this is a hopeless system, we've got to do something better. Well, the hut fees are actually a people parking meter system on the public conservation estate. They are widely flouted, and for any number of good reasons too. It's really just a voluntary tax on the honest. The money doesn't go back to the huts themselves. You see other people, especially foreigners, perhaps not paying hut fees. You think, why on earth should I do? I paid for that, or my ancestors paid for that through my taxes. The system is widely flouted, and yet no one notices. If this were any other government department which had so hopeless a system, everyone would be down on it like a ton of bricks. I think one of the great political mysteries of New Zealand is how it is that the Department of Conservation manages to evade public scrutiny. As much as it does. Right, well, I'm getting near the end, ladies and gentlemen. I'm at the end of my time, too. Well, just a little more about tourism. We traditional recreationalists, trampers and so on, we have doubts about tourism, and we have had for some time. But a generation ago, before the department was established, when we were fighting big battles to save native forests, we were then saying that tourism was the answer, or a large part of it. That it made better economic sense to protect these lands and charge tourists to see them than it would do to log or to mine or to flood them. Of course, we'd argue now that tourists on the public conservation estate, and indeed elsewhere, are intruding on our own simple pleasures and that we're not charging them enough. And really, I think that the arguments for a differential fee for overseas visitors to the public conservation estate, those arguments are very strong, and the sooner it happens, a big issue. Tourism management is a big issue, and tourists do come at a cost. But I do think that actually a bigger issue may arise when the tourists stop, as they will sooner or later. A global financial crisis, serious war, surge in oil prices, change in exchange rates, a serious crime against tourists, there have been a few already, which somehow strikes a nerve overseas. And even without these things, New Zealand will eventually become passé. And what do we do then? Because for a generation, we've been using the economic justification of tourism as a reason for not exploiting in more brutal ways our wild lands. What arguments are we going to use when we can't use the tourism argument anymore? And I must say, looking at the right, so that's an interesting question. As far as tourists ousting New Zealanders from their own land and the Great Walks, I'm inclined to recall the attitude of a tramper friend of mine about mountain bike tracks. We're being pushed off by tracks, the Heafy and so on, by mountain bike tracks. And he says, don't worry, because these mountain bike tracks aren't going to be maintained forever to the necessary high standard. Give it a few years, and a bridge or two will disappear, little bits of the track will fail, mountain bikes won't use it anymore, but the track will still be a great track for trampers. So I think, well, after the tourism bust, the Great Walks to such a high standard will still be great for New Zealanders. Just have a bit of patience. There is, interestingly, a surge of anti-tourist feeling all across the world. There are demonstrations in Europe against tourists. I read about them in the English papers, and there are similar stirrings here. We want to avoid such ill feeling, and we want to avoid the devastating collapse of mass tourism, which would have all sorts of bad consequences for conservation. And we also want to stop the unfair competition which virtually free accommodation on the public conservation estate offers to many small tourist businesses in small towns. I think as far as tourism goes, we are selling ourselves too cheaply, as New Zealanders often do because of our inferiority complex. We're not doing ourselves any favours by being the Ben's bargain basement of wilderness tourism. And therefore, I think a differential fee for overseas tourists is a very good idea. The people such a fee discourages may be the ones we like the most, the young, fit, beautiful, environmentally conscious, penniless backpackers, but our tourism policy should be guided by more than our sexual fantasies. Right. Well, righto, briefly, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not saying that the Department of Conservation is going to disappear. I have no idea what's going to happen, and it all depends on politics, of course. Oh, yes. And it would be a bit of a convulsion if it did. But nevertheless, all the time other government departments are reorganised and amalgamated and renamed. And it just occurs to me that the preconditions necessary for major reorganisation of the conservation area of administration are in existence. Because after all, if I may be the devil's advocate, the Department of Conservation is a department which has abandoned maintenance of the less popular parts of the conservation estate. It's not really interested in recreationists at all. It spends a third of its budget on something entirely outside its official brief, which is tourism. It is not in charge of the predator-free New Zealand project, which really is the one great hope for so many native species. That would solve much of our conservation conundrum. It exhibits some dismaying inefficiencies. There's even a game animal council in existence now, which, although it doesn't actually do much at present, could nevertheless if it were called upon to do so, move into the game management area. If there were a government that wanted to do away with the department, then many of the necessary steps to doing away with the department have already been taken. There are all sorts of things that have been done which would, to other bodies in existence to which departmental functions could be handed. Well, I don't know what's going to happen, good or bad, but I do, in conclusion, two things. One is the department and conservation laws are only as strong as the conservation movement is. There has to be a lobby group for conservation. There's a lobby group for everything else, and it seems to me something of a paradox that at a time when environmental crisis all over the world is really starting to kick in, the environmental movement in New Zealand, which still exists, I'm not denying for a second, it is not the power in the land that it once was. When you consider the strength of that movement in the days when I was young, when we had Manipuri, the immense battles over native forests, the establishment of the Department of Conservation. Conservation then was really a force in the land. And although it still potters along, yet nevertheless it's not that force it was. And sooner or later, if we're not careful, governments are actually going to realise that the conservation movement is actually a bit of a paper tiger and that it can move against it without too much trouble. The future of conservation does depend on the future of the conservation movement. And the final point I was going to make, because it's always important and necessary to end on a happy note. Here's a happy note to end on. Suppose that predator-free New Zealand actually succeeded. Suppose that mustelids and rats and possums and cats were eliminated from New Zealand, and that everywhere there were birds in abundance. And as in the 19th century, schools had to be closed because the bird song occasionally. This was true of some schools in remote country districts, that occasionally they had to be closed because the bird song was actually so deafening that it interrupted the lessons. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? Would that solve our problems? Well, actually, no, it wouldn't. It would actually just bring on another set of problems, because in Wellington now, where there is the Zealandia sanctuary, formerly the Karori sanctuary, where kaka, for example, our lovable bush parrot, are breeding in vast numbers, kaka are actually causing immense problems in the botanic gardens in Wellington and private gardens. They're destroying, damaging trees, ring-barking them, introducing disease, fruit trees. They're eating the flashing in houses, garden furniture, joinery around windows, and they are actually becoming a serious problem. And of course, one reason why parakeets were shot by the pioneers in the late 19th century was just because they descended in such huge flocks on their orchards, and they simply had to be controlled. You might think to yourself, well, wouldn't it be great to have problems like that? But there would still be interesting legal issues there as to how we would deal with those problems. But that is another story, ladies and gentlemen. Right, well, look, I'm sorry. That was a bit of a rush, ladies and gentlemen, to get through everything I had to say. But look, we have 8 minutes left now for questions before I have to say goodbye, and then we talk quietly outside. Do you have any matters you would like to raise, sir?
You mentioned about the increased helicopter flights on the Darren Mountains. Do you know whether Doc's been taking a task over that? And if not, is that set a precedent for other places?
Yes, as I understand it, Forest and Bird, FMC has made another complaint to the Ombudsman. That's my understanding, as it made a complaint to the Ombudsman about the root burn guiding, but I haven't heard of any result of that.
I'm talking about the Chudico, Notori.
Oh, yeah, yes, exactly. Yes, that one. Yes, no. I think FMC has made a complaint about that to the Ombudsman, and the Ombudsman is reviewing that. Now, the department did say that there's a shadow of legality here. The department did say that this increase from, I'm pretty sure it was from 10 to 80, it was actually allowed under the research clause in the, which is. the department, it seems to me, it's always half the time, it's hovering on the verge of legality. There's a research clause. We can do research into tourism and how many flights we'll have and all the rest. Just as the department is actually required by law to review its CMSs, its conservation and management strategies, every 10 years. And there's at least one which is over 20 years old. And the department takes advantage of another little clause in the Act which says that it's possible to get an extension. And yes, it is possible to get an extension, but surely, we lawyers argue, surely Parliament intended that just to cover exceptional situations, just a little bit here, a little bit there. For Parliament, for the department to use this simply not to have essentially any review at all, that sounds dangerously like an exercise of the dispensing power, which was of course declared illegal in the Bill of Rights of 1688. And which occasionally arises to confound the New Zealand government again. See the case of Fitzgerald and Muldoon, among other things. I'm sorry. So that hand was there next, and then you're next, Mum. Yes, hello.
It seems to me that at the moment, the native forest in our native animals is taking a bit of a step back, and it's the rivers and the water that seem to be the issue that's now gaining more interest in the public. But that's still a conservation issue, although it's obviously about dairy cows and stuff like that. But does that perhaps suggest that rather than a complete lack of interest, it's more that the interest has changed, and that we can see that this can also be parlayed into a more general interest in supporting conservation?
I'd have to agree with you there that you do have a point. Although having said that, you also hear, I can't remember any details offhand, but you do read alarming figures about how I think 2/3 of New Zealanders think that native species are actually fine, and there aren't any. I can't recall if 2/3 is the exact figure. There was a survey a few months ago to that effect. And possibly also water is tied up with other issues also of foreign ownership and resentment perhaps of rich dairy farmers and what have you also. But I at the same time I do agree with it that there is still an environmental concern which is evidenced in that.
And a recreational concern as well. So that takes with the idea that we should be able to swim and actually enjoy our rivers as well as perhaps promote the conservation of an area that hasn't had much interest in the past, like the fish and the small animals.
Yes, well, that's true. That's true. Yes. Right. Oh.
One of the things that Predator-Free New Zealand seems to be doing, and they're doing it in the Port Hills, is working with private landowners to reduce stuff there.
Yes.
Are you proposing that, or are you recommending that DOC should come and tell private landowners what they do? Because I don't think somehow that there would be quite the same buy-in.
No, that's true. But
some of them, whoever it is, find some way to remove the 13 bloody peacocks that somebody has dumped on the Port Hills. We have this wonderful native bird, it's called a peacock.
Ah, yes, I used to have peacocks. Yes, I got rid of them. It wasn't the cry, it was more that they were large birds and they liked my friends, yeah. Ah, right. I believe the best thing to do is to skin them beforehand, and then to dress them up in their skins before the servants carry them into the great hall. Yes, no, it's true. No, there is no. There are. There will indeed be landowner resistance to working with the Department of Conservation, because the Department of Conservation, from time to time, well, it's awkward. I mustn't be seen to be attacking the department excessively, and I can see the department's point of view on various occasions, and the department has to work gently, certainly with many landowners. But having said that, there are always going to be bloody-minded landowners. For example, there are several landowners landowners, I think there are only 2, admittedly, on the whole of Banks Peninsula who refuse to allow the extermination of wild goats on their properties. Most landowners are very reasonable about the extermination of feral goats, but there are 2 who aren't. Yes, working with the. But I was interested though at the launch of the Banks Peninsula Conservation Trust years ago, which was at the Monument. Were you there? Anyway, it was at the Monument, just over Port Levy, just my backyard, and. It was a local landowner who had established a perpetual covenant over this particular area around the monument, and the official speeches were about what a wonderful thing this was, protected in perpetuity. But privately, there were people in the department, and also, I must say, some of my conservationist friends who were actually outraged at this device, which was obviously a ploy, a cynical ploy to enable a landowner actually to continue to own this land, and also he'd probably be expecting some payback and some quid pro quo for it, which doesn't actually seem unreasonable, that he should get something back. And clearly their attitude was that if land had any wild values at all, the proper place for that land was in the department, administered by highly paid bureaucrats who would occasionally let us wander over it. And that simply isn't a goer as a recipe for the future. There has to be scope for. I think I'm drifting from your question here, Mum. I'm sorry, but there has to be obviously has to be scope for the accommodation of many private interests. Yes, well, there's a thought. Sir.
Given the general antagonism in New Zealand towards genetic engineering, what do you see as the future of gene editing techniques such as CRISPR-Cas9 in achieving predator-free New Zealand by 20...
Oh, isn't that? That's a sizzler, isn't it? Yes. Ins and means. And what are the Australians going to think when we start altering their possums? I think actually the Australians are actually concerned. Oh, sorry.
They'll probably change their parliament again.
Actually, who's the Prime Minister of Australia? I don't know. What month is it? Yes. Yes, well, that's a tricky one, isn't it? Ends and means. Does one justify the other? I mean, Aldous Huxley argued there's no difference between ends and means, as I recall, that the means we use determines the end which we achieve, and if we therefore, presumably, if we are using genetic engineering, we would be accepting the manipulation of nature in principle, and that it is therefore it's something which is quantitatively different from simply killing them. But if we are manipulating them, then by that very manipulation we are making ourselves the masters of creation in a new way. On the whole, I must say, my own instincts are against it. I think we should. I'd prefer just to have a more hands-on approach. Well, let's just see what research comes up with.
On the other hand, we accept some genetic engineering because the insulin used by most diabetics is produced by genetically engineered bacteria and yeast.
Oh, no. I thought we were going to say pigs. I thought that I had the idea that.
Not yet.
Oh, not yet. Oh, right. Oh, well. Yes, exactly. That's an awkward one, isn't it? Yes. Well, I'll leave it there if you don't mind. So I'll leave that answer there. Hello. Yes, Mum.
At the end of the day, do you think it's the lack of funding that's making DOC do all these sort of negative things like abandoning the tracks and huts and selling up this land? Do you think it's because they don't have enough money?
Well, I can't understand why governments don't give the department just a little bit more money, just a bit more money would make such a difference. And the tourism industry surely is perfectly capable of looking after itself, and it doesn't need any subsidies from Parliament, or any more subsidies from Parliament and from the Department of Conservation. And I would have thought that it would be a sensible thing for any government simply to reorganise things there, organise a bit more funding. It's not going to break the bank at all, and then we all always read about, there'll be another department here that has got a bit more money. I cannot understand, this is another political mystery, I cannot understand why conservation does not get a bit more money, just a bit more money, from the present government. And I would imagine that a Labour New Zealand First government would be keener to give rather more money to the department. I notice that Winston has been saying some. Unfortunately, one of Winston's chaps. Mr. Prosser has been a bit of an opponent of 1080, but Winston himself has actually been saying some rather statesmanlike things about 1080 and how conservation must come first. I think Winston is covering his bases there in quite an acceptable way. But I can't understand why the department doesn't get a bit more money. I've thought most New Zealanders would still applaud it, even if they didn't take much of an interest. They'd either applaud it or not care. But it's not the sort of thing that would condemn. No one is going to say, "Oh, it's so bad that the Department of Conservation got 50 million more." They might say, I don't care, but they wouldn't actually say it's a bad thing. I don't see how any government could lose votes over that. Well, goodness me, ladies and gentlemen, it's 8:05, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to drive you out. Thank you. Thank you very much. Happy times in the hills.